Have you ever felt that no matter how softly you loved, no matter how deeply you understood, no matter how carefully you carried the hearts of others, something about you still unsettled people? Not because you were cruel, not because you demanded too much, but because your presence forced them to confront parts of themselves they spent years trying to avoid. There are women in this world who were taught to become mirrors for everyone else's comfort. Women who shrink their intelligence to protect fragile egos. Women who silence their intuition because truth often costs affection. Women who wear emotional masks so convincingly that even they forget who they truly are beneath them. But then, there is another kind of woman. A woman who walks through life carrying an unusual stillness. A woman who has suffered enough to stop begging for validation. A woman whose silence is not weakness but awareness. And when a man encounters a woman like this, something ancient inside him begins to tremble. Because from the perspective of psychology, the human mind is not frightened by beauty nearly as much as it is frightened by authenticity. Most people can survive attraction. They can survive desire. But very few people can survive being truly seen. And that is why a woman who has faced her own darkness becomes unforgettable. She does not simply touch emotions. She awakens the unconscious. She exposes hidden fractures beneath carefully constructed identities. She makes people feel the weight of their own emotional repression without ever speaking about it directly. Her energy becomes a mirror held against the soul, and many men are not prepared for what they see inside that reflection. There comes a moment when a man realizes that you are not like the others, not because you are louder, not because you seek attention, but because you no longer perform for acceptance. You move differently, you love differently, you leave differently, and suddenly, everything he once understood about power, relationships, intimacy, and emotional control begins to collapse. Because deep down he expected another temporary connection, another distraction, another woman willing to abandon herself for the illusion of love. But instead he encountered someone who had already walked through emotional ruin and survived it. Someone who no longer confuses loneliness with desperation. Someone who understands silence. Someone who no longer fears abandonment because she has already learned how to survive her own storms alone. And what if I told you that this is precisely what terrifies him? Not your independence alone, not your beauty alone, not your intelligence alone, but the terrifying realization that you cannot be psychologically controlled through the ordinary mechanisms that once worked on others. Guilt no longer manipulates you. Emotional inconsistency no longer traps you. Empty validation no longer seduces you. You have begun the painful process of individuation. The process where a human being slowly becomes whole by confronting their shadow rather than running from it. And once a woman begins that transformation, she becomes difficult to dominate emotionally because she no longer needs illusions to feel worthy. Most people never realize this. They think relationships fail because of incompatibility, but often relationships fracture because one person begins awakening while the other remains deeply attached to unconscious patterns. One person seeks truth, the other seeks comfort. One seeks emotional depth, the other seeks control disguised as affection. And when these two energies collide, love becomes a battlefield between authenticity and fear. So tonight, as you listen to these words, perhaps a quiet part of you already understands. Perhaps this video found you because somewhere inside your soul, you are exhausted from pretending to be smaller than you truly are. Exhausted from carrying emotional worlds that others refuse to acknowledge. Exhausted from apologizing for your depth in a society addicted to superficiality. And perhaps for the first time in a long time, you are ready to understand why your difference unsettles people so profoundly. Because the truth is far deeper than attraction. It is psychological, it is spiritual, and it begins in the shadows. The first thing that terrifies him is the fact that you cannot be easily read. In a world where most people reveal themselves through constant noise, impulsive reactions, endless validation seeking, and emotional dependency, your silence becomes psychologically disorienting. Not because you are hiding something malicious, but because your inner world is deeper than surface perception can grasp. Most individuals spend their entire lives constructing personalities designed for social survival. They become experts at adaptation, experts at pleasing, experts at becoming whatever earns them love, safety, or approval. But somewhere along the way, they lose contact with their authentic self. Their emotions become performances. Their relationships become negotiations. Their identities become masks carefully maintained through fear of rejection. And then they meet you. At first, he may interpret your calmness as mystery, but over time, he begins sensing something far more unsettling beneath it. You are not trying to impress him. You are not anxiously chasing reassurance. You are not desperately molding yourself into his fantasies, and this creates a psychological disturbance inside him, because the unconscious mind expects predictable emotional patterns. It expects manipulation, it expects emotional bargaining, it expects hidden agendas disguised as romance. But when a woman arrives carrying emotional self-awareness instead of emotional hunger, many men unconsciously panic, because suddenly their usual methods of maintaining emotional control stop functioning. You must understand something painful about human psychology. Many people do not fall in love with authenticity. They fall in love with emotional familiarity, even if that familiarity is toxic, even if it destroys them. The unconscious gravitates toward what it already understands. This is why emotionally unavailable individuals repeatedly attract emotionally wounded partners. This is why chaos often feels more exciting than peace. And this is why your emotional depth becomes frightening to someone who has spent years disconnected from themselves. Your silence forces him inward, and inward is the one direction most people spend their entire lives avoiding. When you remain calm during manipulation, he feels exposed. When you refuse to compete for attention, he feels destabilized. When you walk away from inconsistency instead of begging for clarity, he feels powerless. Not because you are trying to punish him, but because your behavior unconsciously reveals his own emotional immaturity. You become a mirror standing silently in front of the hidden parts of him he buried long ago. His insecurities, his fear of vulnerability, his need for validation, his unresolved wounds hidden beneath of masculine pride. And nothing terrifies the ego more than exposure without escape. There is something profoundly lonely about becoming emotionally conscious, because once you awaken to your own patterns, you begin noticing the unconscious patterns in everyone else. You begin seeing how often people confuse possession with love. You begin recognizing how many conversations are merely performances designed to avoid intimacy. You begin understanding that many individuals would rather lose authentic connection than confront their own shadow. And this realization changes the way you move through the world. You stop explaining yourself endlessly. You stop forcing emotional reciprocity. You stop trying to rescue people committed to misunderstanding you. Not because you become cold, but because suffering has taught you the sacred value of your emotional energy. The storms you survived transformed you. The betrayals refined your perception. The loneliness deepened your relationship with yourself. And now, when someone enters your life carrying unconscious chaos, your spirit recognizes it before your heart can romanticize it. This is why your presence feels different. You are no longer operating from emotional survival. You are operating from awareness. And awareness is terrifying to those who still depend on illusion. A man senses this instinctively, even if he cannot articulate it consciously. He feels that you see beyond appearances, beyond charm, beyond status, beyond carefully rehearsed confidence. He realizes that with you, performance will never be enough. And for someone who built his identity around external validation, this realization feels like standing naked before a mirror in complete darkness. The tragedy is that many men secretly crave a woman like you while simultaneously fearing her. They desire emotional depth until it begins demanding honesty. They desire authenticity until it threatens their defenses. They desire unconditional love while refusing to confront the wounds preventing them from receiving it. So they oscillate between attraction and withdrawal, between fascination and fear. between wanting closeness and sabotaging it the moment intimacy becomes real. And slowly, you begin understanding that your difference was never the problem. The problem was that your presence awakened realities others were not prepared to face. And somewhere within that painful realization, your transformation quietly begins. One of the deepest reasons you terrify him is because you have learned how to survive loneliness without abandoning yourself. This may sound simple on the surface, but psychologically, it is one of the rarest forms of inner power a human being can possess. Most people fear solitude not because they dislike being alone, but because silence removes distraction. And without distraction, the unconscious begins to speak. Old wounds emerge from beneath the surface. Buried grief rises like smoke from forgotten ruins. Regret, shame, insecurity, emotional dependency. All the fragments carefully hidden beneath daily noise suddenly become impossible to ignore. This is why so many individuals remain trapped in unhealthy relationships. They are not in love with the other person. They are terrified of meeting themselves in the silence left behind. But somewhere along your journey, something inside you broke open. Perhaps it happened after betrayal. Perhaps after abandonment. Perhaps after giving your soul to people who only loved the parts of you that benefited them. There comes a moment in certain lives where suffering strips away illusion with brutal honesty. You stop romanticizing temporary affection. You stop confusing attention with connection. You stop sacrificing your identity to avoid loneliness. And in that painful awakening, you discover something transformative. Solitude does not destroy you. It reveals you. At first, this revelation feels unbearable. Nights become oceans. Silence becomes heavy. You question your worth. You revisit memories like wandering through the ruins of an old city, searching for answers that no longer exist. The unconscious mind begins confronting every unresolved emotional wound all at once. The inner child cries for validation. The shadow whispers fears you spent years suppressing. And for a while, it feels easier to return to familiar pain than continue walking through emotional darkness alone. But if you survive this stage without betraying yourself, something extraordinary happens. You begin building a relationship with your own soul. Slowly, you stop needing constant reassurance. Your peace no longer depends on external approval. Your emotional stability no longer collapses because someone withdraws affection. You learn how to sit beside your suffering without letting it consume your identity. You become emotionally present with yourself, and this changes your entire energy. A man senses this immediately, because many people unconsciously depend on emotional dependency to feel significant. They need to feel needed. They need to feel emotionally central in another person's life, because it protects them from confronting their own emptiness. But when he meets a woman who can survive without clinging, something destabilizes inside him. He realizes he cannot secure your devotion through fear. He cannot maintain your attention through inconsistency. He cannot control your emotional state by withholding affection. And suddenly, the entire psychological structure he once relied upon begins collapsing. This is not about arrogance. It is not about emotional coldness. It is about inner grounding. You no longer approach relationships from desperation. You approach them from wholeness. And that difference changes everything. You must understand how unusual this is in modern relationships. Society quietly conditions people to fear being alone more than being emotionally unfulfilled. People stay in relationships where they feel invisible, simply to avoid confronting silence. They accept emotional breadcrumbs because temporary validation feels safer than solitude. But a woman who has already walked through loneliness and transformed within it becomes psychologically difficult to manipulate, because fear no longer governs her choices. And this frightens him in ways he may never openly admit. He begins sensing that if he loses you, you will grieve deeply, but you will survive. You will not collapse into self-destruction. You will not abandon your dignity to chase someone incapable of emotional depth. You have already survived too much to lose yourself now. And paradoxically, this is what makes your love more meaningful than anyone else's. Because you choose connection consciously rather than desperately. There is immense power in being chosen by someone who does not need you for survival. And many men are emotionally unprepared for that kind of love. Because love without dependency requires vulnerability. It requires authenticity. It requires emotional accountability. It removes the illusion of power created by emotional imbalance. Suddenly he cannot rely on games, confusion, or distance to maintain control. He must confront himself honestly. And many people would rather sabotage intimacy than face the terrifying vulnerability required for real connection. This is why emotionally conscious women often feel misunderstood. Their standards are interpreted as arrogance. Their boundaries are interpreted as rejection. Their self-respect is interpreted as emotional unavailability. But beneath these misunderstandings lies a deeper truth. Your inner stability reminds others of the chaos they still carry within themselves. And perhaps that is why your solitude became sacred. Because inside the silence that once nearly destroyed you, you discovered your own worth. Not through applause, not through romance, not through validation, but through surviving yourself. And once a woman learns how to do that, she walks through the world differently. Like someone who has already survived the storm others are still running from. Another truth that terrifies him is your refusal to pour femininity in the way the world expects. There is a profound psychological difference between a woman who seeks approval and a woman who seeks truth. The first learns how to survive through adaptation. She becomes what others desire because somewhere deep inside, she fears abandonment more than self-betrayal. But the second begins questioning everything. She questions social conditioning. She questions emotional roles inherited through generations of silence. She questions why women are often taught to prioritize comfort over authenticity. And once she begins that questioning, she becomes impossible to fully domesticate psychologically. From childhood, many women are subtly conditioned to disconnect from their instinctive nature. They are praised for being agreeable, accommodating, emotionally available, endlessly forgiving. They learn that softness is rewarded when it remains convenient for others. They learn to silence anger because anger threatens acceptance. They learn to suppress intuition because truth disrupts illusion. Over time, this repression creates a painful fracture within the psyche. The authentic self retreats into the unconscious while the socially acceptable self takes control. But eventually, suffering exposes the cost of this fragmentation. Perhaps after years of emotional exhaustion. Perhaps after relationships where your empathy was mistaken for weakness. Perhaps after repeatedly abandoning your needs to preserve temporary peace. There comes a moment when the soul can no longer tolerate the performance. The mask begins cracking. The shadow rises. Repressed emotions emerge like storms breaking through old walls. And what follows is not merely healing. It is psychological rebirth. You stop apologizing for your depth. You stop reducing your intelligence to protect fragile egos. You stop pretending not to notice emotional inconsistency. You stop romanticizing emotionally unavailable people simply because they trigger old wounds. And as your awareness deepens, your energy changes in ways that others instinctively feel. This transformation unsettles him because your authenticity exposes the artificial nature of many social dynamics. You no longer flirt for validation. You no longer perform emotional weakness to appear desirable. You no longer seek permission to exist fully. And because of this, many men cannot categorize you comfortably. You challenge unconscious expectations about control, femininity, emotional access, and identity itself. A psychologically unconscious man often desires a woman who reflects his idealized fantasy. But a conscious woman reflects reality. She reveals contradictions. She notices emotional immaturity. She senses manipulation beneath charm. She recognizes wounds hidden beneath arrogance. And this can feel deeply threatening to someone whose identity depends on maintaining illusions. Your intuition becomes especially terrifying because intuition is not easily explained logically. It operates beneath language, beneath conscious thought. It senses shifts in emotional energy before behavior confirms them outwardly. Many women spend years doubting this instinct because society teaches them to prioritize external appearances over internal knowing. But once you reconnect with your intuition, you begin seeing through emotional performances with startling clarity. And suddenly, relationships change. You notice when words and energy do not align. You notice when affection hides selfishness. You notice when someone seeks access to your emotional warmth without offering genuine emotional presence in return. You notice when people are attracted to your light but unwilling to confront their darkness. And because you notice these things, you become harder to deceive. This is not because you are cynical. It is because pain sharpened your perception. There is something almost mythical about